Hello everyone. I want to just quickly introduce myself and introduce our wonderful participant in this conversation, Julie Kushner. We're doing this for The Forge, an issue on labor in the university. And my name is Sam Klug. I am a historian and organizer. I've organized with the Harvard Graduate Students Union, UAW. And I'm currently teaching history at George Mason University. And I'm delighted to be joined by Julie Kushner, state senator for the Connecticut State Senate, 24th District, I believe, and longtime UAW organizer with a lot of experience organizing several different sort of varieties of workers in higher education. So thank you so much for joining us, Julie.
It's my pleasure. It's great to be here to talk about these subjects that are always relevant and always interesting.
Yeah, and particularly interesting in new ways right now, I think. So just to start us off, I'm wondering if you could just sort of tell folks what got you involved in organizing and what led you to make a career out of labor organizing.
Well, I was very young when I started organizing, and I definitely came from a political perspective that we needed to change the world, and that the best way to do that would be to start with workers and their workplace rights and really building strong organizations of workers. And so that didn't come to me immediately, but pretty quickly. I graduated after a number of experiences at different universities to get an undergraduate degree. And this was it was around 1975. So I did what most women did at that time. I became a secretary, and I worked at the university that I graduated from. And it didn't take me long to realize that it was really important to organize amongst my coworkers. And at that time, we were much more geared toward consciousness raising, women's rights, but it really quickly evolved into union organizing. And so I became a union organizer in 1977. My interest was in organizing secretaries, which at that time, was a frontier of organizing. And I was very fortunate to work with a group of women who were very collaborative and very interested in learning from each other, as well as looking at past organizing models, but really developing new models to meet the challenges of this new frontier.
Absolutely, yeah. And so the new model you're talking about, what did that sort of look like for organizing secretaries in a university? I know you were very involved with District 65, which is a sort of legendary part of the labor movement that organized many unorganized workers in New York, dating back all the way to the 30s and 40s. But in the 70s and 80s, a big frontier they're organizing was in clerical workers in universities.
Right.
And sort of, so what kind of new model was developed in those campaigns, and why do you think that new model was so effective?
I think that so we had to go through making some mistakes before we figured out best practices. And I think some of the mistakes we made, because a number of people came from university environments, came from publishing, we thought we could write it all down in a very cohesive message. And, it might take pages and pages to make our point, but that people would sit down and read it and they would join the union. And that was a mistake we made early on. We figured it out quickly, though, that wasn't effective. And we really, I think probably we took from the old methods of having committees, worker committees that were present in the workplace, and really very organic, as I mentioned. But then I think we expanded that to look toward having organizers that really reflected the workforce. So that meant a lot of women, a lot of young women, women with children, which hadn't happened in the labor movement before. When I had my first child in 1979, I was working on an organizing campaign, and the president said, oh, well, so you'll be like leaving after this, right? And I'm like, no, I'm coming back. And he was like, really? No one's ever done that. They have their babies and then they find another job in the labor movement, but not as organizers. And I think some of that, really focusing on connecting with workers in a deeper, more organic way was really important to the model. I think developing broad committees that were really prepared to commit for the long haul. These campaigns were not quick campaigns. They weren't like in manufacturing where you could go in and you can organize quickly and turn around and have a strike for recognition. They were much more geared toward a long, well-developed campaign that could sustain itself against an anti-union campaign from the employer. That the anti-union campaign was very different too. It wasn't as much driven by firing the leaders. It was more driven by a web of misinformation and fear. And so fear is always it's the same fear. It's just that it exhibited differently, not so much firing people as much as making them afraid they would lose something.
And this is at Columbia you're referring to in the 80s?
Absolutely. And so we started organizing in Columbia. I started on the campaign in 1980. We had already failed in the previous election. And I had just had my son, and we went about a long-term campaign plan where we really developed a base amongst the workers. And it was very strategic in thinking about where are the majority of the workers, where do you have to win in order to, in a very strategic but also very calculated way, looking at the numbers of workers. And, we had always been strong in the humanities and, in the small faculty offices where there wasn't any real strong opposition, but really had trouble breaking into the areas like the registrar's office or the bursar, back then they called it the bursar's office, or the controller's office, and the big pools of workers. And there were lots of racial elements to this too, because in those bigger pools there were more workers of color than in the faculty offices, and so there were real divisions. And so figuring out how do you conquer, how do you master that, how do you develop leadership that will carry you through that. And you have access in faculty offices, you didn't have access in the administrative offices. So, all of these challenges had to be figured out. And basically we developed a model where we found leaders, real leaders in those departments who would organize their coworkers and relied on us for guidance and information, but did the organizing themselves inside.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not anything new, and I'm not trying to say that was different. I think the main difference was that it took longer. People had very little experience with unions, so that they didn't have some experience to draw on from another work experience. So they were really, this was very brand new to them. And in some ways that was harder because you had to be able to explain how this would work. But in some ways it was better because people felt like, this is exciting. This is something new. This is something that might really make a difference.
Right. Yeah. That lack of experience with unions, or lack of even having any contact with the union in the past, is, that's sadly increasingly the experience for all kinds of workers in the United States with our sort of declining union density. But in higher ed, I think it's also, particularly something we've come up against in the grad union campaigns of the last decade as well. People not sort of knowing what unions are, and people also having a sense that, well, unions are for other people. They're not for us, not for workers like us. And so I'm curious how it sounds like you confronted some of that as well in these District 65 campaigns. How did that sort of get resolved?
Well, that was the case for secretaries too. They were like, oh, unions aren't for secretaries, they're for factory workers. And then being challenged by the fact in 1980, the District 65, which that campaign started before, as I mentioned, we'd lost a previous campaign. So we were branded as District 65, and now we affiliated with the United Auto Workers. And so the management just loved that, because now all the literature is, why would you want to join the auto workers? And that's still the same message you hear today, whether you're organizing faculty or graduate workers. it's the same message. Employers, like, why would you want to join the auto workers? And they fail to mention, the historic evolution of organizing within the UAW amongst academic workers. So, but it was, I think that the way we overcame that was just, again, really not letting them carry the day with their narrative and having our own focus on the issues that were important to the workers. And there were so many issues of discrimination, particularly at Columbia, where a high percentage of the workforce at that time, it was still a minority workforce. It was people of color were about 48% of the unit. And so there were still majority white employees, but the discrimination in wages was very real, very tangible, very evident, and then was confirmed once we were successful and had the information to back that up. There were problems with healthcare. That was at a time when healthcare costs were rising, as they continue to do. And that was really the first wave of concessions, where they weren't concessions at that point because the employer could just do whatever they wanted, but changing the health plans and, making people pay more out of their pocket. There were all kinds of problems. The introduction of video display terminals, the whole beginning of computerization, and these VDTs, they used to call them, the screen, the monitors, the computers themselves had a lot of health hazards, and ergonomics were like going crazy. And people were getting carpal tunnel for the first time, headaches from the machines have changed a lot, but in the 1970s and 80s, the science of it hadn't evolved, and people were actually getting sick from it. And so there were all kinds of issues, health and safety issues, that you'd never expect in a university. And so we focused on those issues, and we made demands along the way, and we, exposed a lot of the problems. And most people weren't then that interested in the university's line of, well, why would you want to be an auto workers union? Here it was like, but these are our coworkers. These, you can't label us as you call us outsiders, but when we see the list of names and which departments they work in, this from your own experience, all of a sudden that line that it's a bunch of outsiders just doesn't resonate. It's not accurate, and it doesn't resonate.
Absolutely. Right. You make it tangible for people that, no, I'm actually working the same work you're working, and we have these problems. And then it's not like you're branded as, oh, the outside auto worker anymore, or at least they still try to brand you that way, and it doesn't land in quite the same way. Yeah, it is quite amazing how familiar a lot of those problems sound to the organizing work we've done among grad workers recently. And you, of course, have had a big role in that as well. So after your time organizing with District 65, the Columbia clerical workers campaigns, which ultimately you did win recognition, right? In was it 85?
We petitioned for an election in 1980. It took 3 years to get the election. And in 1983, we had the election. And then it took 2 more years to get through the morass of the legal challenges that they put us through. And then ultimately we were certified. But it was 5 years to go from the time we petitioned for an election. That's why I say, like, digging in and being committed to these long-term campaigns, it was well worth it. And the people we developed, the leaders within Columbia, were very committed to being there and sticking with it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That is a really long road.
And the first contract, though, I mean, when I think back about the changes that we made in that first contract, I mean, people were angry and they were hungry for change, and they were ready to really take on the challenge. And so we had a strike deadline. We negotiated. It was a very intense negotiations. It lasted months and months and months, probably about 18 months of negotiations. And ultimately we had a strike deadline, and we were not able to settle. And we ended up striking. And after I think the university was in total shock that we actually went out on strike. We had incredibly strong support. And after 4 days, they settled with us, and we won major changes. We improved the wages. We won an equity fund to address inequities, and particularly racial inequities in wages. We rolled back some of the healthcare concessions. We got job classification language that was really important to win. There were just a multitude of changes that were flexible work hours, reasonably scheduled flexible work hours for working moms and students. It was a remarkable first contract. And I think that it really did feel like we were changing lives. And that's what makes this all worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely. So that, just the familiarity of sort of hearing about sort of the legal challenges and the challenges of sort of building bridges across departments. How then did you try to translate that experience when you were in a different position in the UAW and were working with graduate student workers in the 2000s and 2010s?
So, well, the graduate student organizing began earlier than that, and I was very fortunate because District 65 was involved in California at the University of California. It became a UAW campaign, but it started with District 65, and I actually went out and met with the TAs at Berkeley, and I remember being extremely intimidated, like, oh my God, I'm going to be meeting with faculty, with TAs, with people who taught me when I was in college, and I was like really intimidated about going into those meetings. And what I learned very quickly is that, yes, they were highly intelligent people with, a knowledge of labor history, of science, of mathematics, things that I had no idea about, but they didn't know how to organize. And what they really wanted from us was the expertise on how to build an organizing campaign. And I think with the graduate work organizing, that was the early 90s, mid 90s. By 1998, NYU was boiling over, and workers at NYU were looking for ways to change their conditions. And I came in strictly to help with a small group of people that were friends. A former union organizer with District 65 was in the American Studies department getting her PhD. And she said, can you just help us do a strategic plan? And so that's how I got involved, and spent an afternoon helping them develop their strategic plan for organizing. And a few months later, they called me back and said, we'd just like to organize with you. Would you help us? And the UAW. And I said, of course. And I think what was really helpful was my experience in universities with clerical workers. So I'd already been through that. Are they really workers? And do they really belong in the UAW? And so for me, it helped me to sort of understand that what was important was to make sure that we were clear about what made a teaching assistant or a research assistant a worker. Like, what are the elements of what you do that are clearly work, so that we could dispel the myth that somehow academic work isn't real work. And we needed to dispel that myth, both amongst the workers, obviously, but also amongst the public. And that was sort of the way we went into the NYU campaign, particularly, although there were unions for graduate workers in the public sector, not in the private sector. And so we knew there would be this was another one of those times when we knew there was going to be a legal challenge, that we were going to need to put resources into the legal fight, but that we were also going to need to commit for a long-term campaign in order to be successful. And the UAW was prepared to do that. And provide those resources. The workers were prepared to, stay involved and commit to years-long campaign. And I think the work took shape then. And it really, the organizing of graduate employees was modeled more about modeling after other workers' campaigns, other like workers, white-collar workers' campaigns. And rather than trying to show that academic work is something different. We were really focused on showing how it was real work and the same kind of work, deserving the same kind of workplace rights as other occupations.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting you mentioned the kind of public shift that you were trying to achieve, and I'm curious if you think that shift has really happened in the 20 years since that, or 20 plus years since that NYU campaign was getting going.
I hadn't thought about that question. It's a good question. I think that public perception is more accepting of the idea that graduate assistants, teaching and research assistants, faculty will be unionized, can be unionized, should be. I think that's more acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, I would question whether we've really convinced some of those key decision makers in public places whether the work is, whether it's real work.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I don't want to name names or anything, but we got some really big, powerful elected officials who were extremely helpful. And I think they did that out of a commitment to building, understanding the importance of the labor movement in our society and wanting to, you know, help in that way. And I think that especially at the beginning of the campaign, we did these forums with some elected officials, you know, major officials. We had Senator Schumer there, for instance. And what I really appreciated was when we organized those forums, they weren't your typical forum, and Senator Schumer was prepared and willing to participate in a way that he hadn't been asked to do so before. Mm-hmm. So instead of coming and making a few remarks and leaving, he came to a meeting and sat in the audience and listened to workers tell their stories for about 45 minutes before he was even, you know, asked to say anything. And then he was asked to comment on it. And you could just sit and watch him during those comments. It was a real educational experience. You could watch him and see that he was beginning to understand things he'd never understood before about academic work. And that was incredibly helpful to us, because having somebody high profile in New York State, you know, and now nationally understand the work in a more real way was extremely important. And I appreciated his willingness to do it. And then he was engaged fully, you know, and really part of the campaign to pressure the university to recognize the union after years and years of legal battles. You know, there were people like Schumer who stayed involved the entire time, and many others in New York City. I mean, lots of other of our elected officials. The faculty were incredibly important. The, you know, undergraduate student organizing was important. And that was true, not just for graduate workers, but even if you look back at the clerical workers in Columbia, those structures, that outside support for what the workers were doing was very helpful.
And we met, of course, in the context of one of those campaigns when you were regional director of Region 9A of the UAW. And I was a student organizer with the Harvard Graduate Students Union. And, you know, at the same time that you were also working with the Columbia graduate students on their campaign, which of course led to the NLRB decision that sort of gave graduate workers at private universities sort of back the rights that the 2004 decision had taken away. And so I'm curious, sort of when you were in that position in the UAW, what you thought was important about organizing student workers for the broader labor movement that you were a part of?
Well, I would say, I think whenever I think about organizing frontiers, you look to industries that previously have been under-organized. And as a result, the kind of things that the employer is able to get away with are detrimental, not just to the worker, but to the entire environment, entire sector. And so whenever you're looking at a new frontier like higher education, you see so many opportunities to address problems that haven't been solved for a very long time. And in some cases, those problems are specifically for the workers. Sometimes it's for the better, for the greater good of the institution. And they just don't get it. They don't realize that. A good example of that would be in healthcare. There was always, I think, an attitude toward healthcare that research assistants and teaching assistants really didn't need that much healthcare coverage because they're young, they're healthy, and that's great unless you happen to get sick or unless you decided to have a baby, or just if you're not minding your day-to-day health needs, and how serious that can be. And I think that attitudes did not reflect the reality in these institutions. And so we have found that healthcare is a really big issue for graduate employees. And once we organize, we can workers start prioritizing what's most important to them. And sometimes that benefits the whole institution. And an example of that is we organized at University of Connecticut. And for years, they had disregarded the healthcare for graduate assistants, and it had gotten worse and worse and worse until it was a really big problem. And we found there as a public institution, we went past the university experts on this issue and went directly to the controller of the state of Connecticut and said, you have health plans, what can you put together for a group like this? And as a result, because they were unionized, they had access to all the information that the law requires an employer to provide to the union. And we were able to really do an analysis and end up with a program that was so good for the graduate workers that it was also good for all the graduate students. And the university saw there was an opportunity that had been missed and moved everybody into that program, not just those they were required to move through collective bargaining. And so, that's the way I think that workers sometimes, and that's not just particular to higher ed, but oftentimes workers can see what would help them would also help the entire sector. And I think that's, for me, organizing graduate employees in higher ed was really about seeing the broader picture and recognizing that there was a lot to be gained from having a university system that was highly organized like other countries, where workers really saw the benefit of having a union. And then conversely, the part that I think going back to your original question, I think for the labor movement, there's a tremendous advantage of organizing graduate employees and other academic workers because of the sort of the energy that's brought to our movement from young workers who are fully engaged and ready to take on, very difficult situations and really do it for all the right reasons, because they're not looking to just benefit themselves, but really make a change in society. And so I think that the benefit to the labor movement is obviously growth, growth in sectors where we have more people organized, we have more power, we have the ability to effectuate more change, but also just the energy that comes from organizing in higher ed.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the University of Connecticut example you gave was like during our campaign, that was sort of held up as like a gold standard of like, this is what we can achieve and what we can do. And it is striking that, the universities often sort of try to do these maneuvers, sort of carving people in and out of bargaining units when, ultimately I think the horizon that we're looking towards is improvement sort of across the sector, across the board, and then as you mentioned, sort of across the broader society as well. So what do you think are some of the kind of new directions that the movement can go in this space of not just graduate workers, but sort of all sort of across the different workers that are brought together on university campuses as we move into the 2020s?
Well, I think probably one of the best stories I have is that when we had succeeded in organizing NYU and getting that first contract, and it was a big deal and people were talking about it. And again, it was another great example of first contract where we made tremendous advances. And I went to a meeting on campus with some faculty and students to talk a little bit about our experience and what we had negotiated. And And I made this reference to, these are lowest paid workers on campus when you look at the work they did. And then someone in the room raised her hand and said, excuse me, but I'm adjunct faculty and we are the lowest paid people in a university. And it was just shocking to me that there's always something else that's there. And so we actually ended up organizing the adjunct faculty at NYU. And so if we had not been involved in organizing the grad assistants, we would not have gone on to organize the adjuncts. And while there are definitely unions that have organized adjunct faculty for many, many decades, not so much where, how do I say this? The times had changed. Universities had really migrated away from full-time faculty to part-time faculty for all the obvious reasons of cost savings and flexibility. And there had not been an effort to organize adjuncts by themselves. And they really needed to be organized as, in some ways, at that moment, and I wouldn't say this is true everywhere or forever, but at that moment, organizing as a standalone, separate unit of adjunct faculty where they were the priority. They weren't, in a bigger unit where their needs weren't going to be really addressed head on. That was a really important thing at NYU, and a decision that the workers made. They came to us and they said, we want to be our own unit. And we agreed to accommodate that. That led to the organizing at the new school of the part-time faculty. So these things snowball, because when you organize and take on the issues of a group of workers, the next group of workers in the place next door, in the case of adjunct faculty, many people worked at both institutions. They see the advances and they want to be part of that. And then I would look at what happened at Columbia, where we were organizing and ended up, after organizing grad employees, organizing the postdoc employees. And so I think that in the university setting, we are looking toward how do you organize the entire university, all of the workers in a university, and then how do they work together in coalition to advance everyone, not just the academic workers, but also the clerical workers and the maintenance workers and the custodians and the whole university community, so that you work as a coalition. And I think ultimately you end up where we see things headed now with undergraduate student workers who are also organizing, and the student athletes that everybody is we're now very much aware of how they're exploited and taken advantage of, and their needs. And so I think that you keep seeing this explosion of organizing in higher ed.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very inspiring vision of a kind of campus-wide organization where each group of workers is sort of organizing for themselves and together. But of course, that isn't where we are right now. And so
we hit a few bumps in the road.
Yeah,
it is
just
interesting.
a couple.
Yes.
One or two.
That's been challenging. What I find fascinating, because I just retired from the UAW in 2018, and as I mentioned, got started with NYU in 1998. So for 20 years, I watched how we would advance, and then the political change in Washington. We would, be on the defensive again with first the Bush administration, the Bush decision at NYU, and then, when Obama won, we were ready. We filed a petition immediately, and we were ready to go. And then we watched the setbacks under the Trump Labor Board. And so I think it's fascinating to me that universities are so resistant to union organizing. And, these are, to me, it's a profound contradiction of the mission of higher education and the way they treat their workers and the way they deny their workers the democratic rights that you would think universities would, not just uphold, but like herald that they would be the leaders in creating freedoms and democracy. And yet when it comes to their own workers, they're some of the worst. And so we've seen this 2 decades now of a fierce fight over organizing rights of workers in higher education. And what I find so rewarding is that they can keep fighting, but the workers find creative ways, and the union finds creative ways to keep fighting as well, and we keep winning. And that's what's really important, is we're not turning our, the UAW hasn't turned its back on these workers. The workers themselves are truly committed to keeping the fight on until they win. And as a result, we've had progress and we've had forward motion.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you mentioned earlier in the conversation about sort of the need for people to be committed for a long haul is really important. And I know for me personally, like work organizing with the Harvard Union, just, people enter grad school and they have a million different things they have to do. And so the concept of sort of being in, a multi-year fight to gain these rights isn't, I think, something that is altogether sort of top of mind for a lot of workers in these positions. And so getting a critical mass of people who are willing to say, this is what we need and we need to stick with it is really maybe the first challenge, I think, of moving forward in any of these cases.
I think that what you find in any group of workers is that if they can see the result of organizing, if they can see the advantage that workers will have, even though that one individual worker might never realize it in their own work life. People, I think the best people, the people who organize unions to me are like the best people, because they're mostly not doing it for themselves. They're doing it for other people, the next generation of workers that come behind them. And, I have a very dear friend, the woman who invited me to her home in 1998 to organize the grads at NYU. And by the time we won that election, when we had the election, she wasn't eligible to vote because she had already moved on to working on it. She was no longer teaching. And then we organized an adjunct unit there. And once again, she had been an adjunct and she missed the vote. She didn't get to vote again, but she worked on these efforts, not for herself and not for her own personal gain, but for what could be done to change the institution.
Absolutely. So, of course, now, as you mentioned, you're retired from the UAW and working as a state legislator. And I'm curious sort of how your career in organizing has informed this new work that you're taking on as a legislator.
Well, it's been really interesting. I mean, I was really recruited to be a candidate in 2018. It wasn't something I had thought about doing or really, I had not planned to retire and be an elected official. My plan was to retire and probably continue to be an organizer somewhere, and continue to build within the labor movement. And I got talked into it because, of course, I was convinced by different allies that I was the best person to flip a long-time Republican seat. And the person I took on was very conservative, very anti-labor in all of his votes. And so I was like the flip side of this guy. We didn't just flip the seat. I was like the polar opposite of my opponent. And so, it was that belief that it would take the kind of resources of someone who had been a progressive and a labor leader for decades and decades. And so the resources, meaning that there were people who were willing to get on the ground and flip the seat. And so that convinced me. What I didn't really understand at the time, even though several people tried to tell me that it would make a difference that I had an organizing background and a bargaining background, much of what happens as a state legislator is about you end up negotiate bills much like you negotiate contracts. And having to find the right compromises that will get enough votes to pass the bill in the best form you can get. So, when it came to the fight for 15, and I became the Senate labor chair because I was, with this background in
how could you not be, right? I mean,
yeah. So, and there were those who said you shouldn't, you don't get pigeonholed into labor just because you come from labor. You don't really want to be the labor chair. Ask for something else. And I'm like, No, no, you don't get it. I want to be the labor chair. This is what I believe really makes a huge difference in people's lives. And so I end up being the labor chair. And the first, I'm there with instructions from our allies to do two things. You got to win the $15 minimum wage, and you got to win paid family and medical leave. And you got to do it at the same time in the same session, and your first time ever as an elected official. Now it's a little, when I look back on it, it was daunting. And they were like, you've got to do it really, if you're going to get both of them, you've got to do it in this order, and you got to do it like day one. You got to be ready to go. So
that's funny. That's very reminiscent of starting an organizing campaign where it's like, okay, you got to sign up all the workers in this amount of time, and it seems impossible, and you got to start right now, and you also have to do these 3 issues and go.
And the thing that was bad is the people who were advising me, they didn't realize that as somebody who had led union organizing campaigns, when I had a deadline, I'm serious about that deadline. We have to meet that deadline. And so it's much harder in the legislature. There are many more things you don't control. Mm-hmm. And so, I had my first meeting, I was installed into office on a Wednesday, and Thursday I had my first meeting. And so I was really like on the timetable, except that all kinds of things interfere with it in the legislature. So I was like desperate that I hadn't met any of my goals, because we were off by weeks, not just days, And so what I found out though, that having the union background really helped in many ways. First of all, as I said, the negotiations, but also I've never believed that any individual is really that powerful. They may think they are powerful, but I don't believe that I could become the state senator and all of a sudden snap my fingers and we would have paid family leave or $15 minimum wage. I always understood it was about the strength of the movement to win these things. And so the organizing aspect of it, organizing your colleagues, working with a coalition, the coalition of organizations became like the organizing committee, meeting every day. Okay, what if we make a compromise over here, is that going to still leave us with a bill that is strong enough to accomplish what we need? And it was really, the decisions were not made by me or other legislators entirely. I mean, we weighed in, but there was a whole coalition of organizations, the labor movement, progressive organizations, women's organizations on paid family leave that helped to shape what that bill was going to look like. And when we couldn't get somebody to vote for it, those people were on the ground, sending postcards and visiting legislators and making phone calls and really bringing together all that organizing energy that you need to create a movement to get something done. And so it was it was just an amazing opportunity to be involved in something that impacted so many people. And, the night we passed the $15 minimum wage, I got quite emotional. I had negotiated some pretty big contracts, for thousands of workers. And I had never felt like we just passed a bill that's going to give 350,000 people a raise.
Wow.
And, that was just like, that was impactful. It made me very emotional to be in and to realize that as important as the labor movement is, and I believe it really is the mover of anything progressive in terms of workers' rights, but having somebody in the legislature who could help be part of, passing a minimum wage increase or a paid family leave bill, I was really happy to be there and be part of it. So it feels good. Although this year was totally different because of the pandemic. We really didn't get to pass the agenda that we had developed, but we'll have the opportunity next year, I'm sure. I'm sure.
Well, that is an inspiring story and an example for sure. Okay, well, we have only a couple minutes left. So just as a kind of final question, since the Forge is sort of a publication by organizers and for organizers, I'm wondering if you were sort of encountering a young organizer today, if there was like one particular piece of advice or sort of nugget that you would want to give them as they sort of go off into organizing their workplace?
I would say be prepared to sacrifice personally. It takes great personal sacrifice to commit yourself to organizing, but to understand that that sacrifice will be more than worth it. You will find, there were many times when I felt like I missed events and, important events in my family, or, worked so hard that I was exhausted. But when you look back at the victories that have been won, it's so well worth it. You feel it's the most rewarding work you could ever do, because you're really making a difference in people's lives, both individuals, but also in the broader movement. And that's an amazing feeling to be part of it.